All right, well, we're going to get started. This is our last formal session, as some of you, I think, heard, as I've been announcing over lunch. Because we moved up the sessions and don't have a keynote, if you're interested in sticking around, if you don't need to get right back on the road right away, we are going to host more of a farmer roundtable learning circle with Klaus Martens to kind of get together. And if you guys have compelling things that you would like to talk about and troubleshoot on your farm, we'll see how it goes. Klaus said they've been doing it in New York with the New York Certified Organic Group. It's gonna be a little bit of an experiment, but we're gonna give it a shot and see how it goes. But it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Nate Powell, and I've known Nate for several years now. We've crossed paths in many different places because Nate does many different things. He's absolutely amazing. I can't believe he's out here, actually, with all the stuff he has to do. He landed in the world of certified organic farming when he successfully became the youngest farmer in the country to achieve organic certification. That's quite the accomplishment. Since 2008, Nate has grown his operation from 10 leased acres to over 1,000 acres, raising crops that include organic wheat, pulses, flax, layers, and cattle, and this is in Montana. In 2019, Nate received the prestigious Organic Trade Association Rising Star Award. That same year, he testified before the U.S. House of Representatives, advocating for policy that recognizes organic agriculture's positive impact in rural communities. In 2020, he was appointed to the farmer seat on the National Organic Standards Board, so we have a National Organic Standards Board member here with us, which is awesome. In the youngest appointee in the board's history, and in 2021 was elected unanimously by his board peers to serve as the chair board. Board chair, not chair board. reading straight up. Board chair. He's currently expanding his operation further into value-added processing, producing certified organic livestock feeds and alfalfa pellets. So please join me in welcoming Nate Powell.
Hello, everybody. The problem with that bio is that as I lift off all the things that I was the youngest for, you peak early. And so I'm trying to now just think about what else can we be doing in this space that's not being done before, but I'm really excited to be here with you all. Nate Powell, I'm based out of Montana, and I raise a few different things. I got kicked off in the world of organic with cattle, and so I know we're talking about integrating cattle and crops. I started with cattle, so I'll talk a little bit about that. I was here for the last presentation, and this specificity of the quality that we have to maintain for dry edible beans, I would argue, is the exact opposite of how I think about livestock. I think about livestock as garbage disposals of everything else that we're needing to find a home for, a market for, or send into something that's going to be producing more manure to make our crops grow. When we were talking about littler combines, littler equipment, this is my John Deere 4400, which I can actually put on a swather trailer and zip around. And I bought it specifically for being able to do this sort of test plot work. And so I totally empathize with everyone's search for that smaller equipment and agree we need to get it in the States. I started off Cold Springs Organic as a beef operation, leasing out organic land, leasing out hay ground. But then as the years have gone by, I've realized that I need to be at it, making my own value-added propositions. And so we have sort of a family of brands now. Cold Springs Organics is our cropping system, and we farm just about 1,500 acres. Gallatin Valley Flour is where we're taking our own hard red spring wheat, our own yellow peas, and making flour, both in retail bags as well as bulk. And then Spring Hill Feeds is where we're taking everything else that we don't have a food grade home for and sending it down into the feed market. In the Northwest, there is not a single commercially viable organic source of feed. And so I've seen a lot of my fellow young farmers interested in getting into organics, getting into farming, wanting to start with livestock, and there not being a real source that you could buy it and actually turn a profit on. So that was our inspiration for making our feed mill. Like I said, I got started off with cattle. I applied for a loan to buy 3 cows when I was 12, and really fell in love with the work. But it screamed to me that after about 5 years of selling calves, 3 or 4 or even 10 calves a year does not a career make. And so I looked to getting into grain because of that. I had a little sideshow of a milk cow. I tried my hand at dairy. We bought this organic milk cow in 2002, and she calved, and it was just explosive mastitis. So my dairy career was very short-lived. But this is Rosebud, fond memories. In my system, the most valuable crop I raise, and it's sort of a niche to the area I grow in, is hard red spring wheat and durum. And so those are crops that we can get really high qualities, 14, 15, 16% protein, which is sharply in demand from food companies around the country. This is one of the products that it goes into. Our durum and yellow peas go into Annie's mac and cheese. And we have a little bit of IP work there. The inspiration again for the processing was that when we were making the supply chain for Annie's, they just kept asking, is there any way you could just send us the clean seed ready to mill so we don't have to ship a tiny amount to our very large co-packers? And so we're starting to work into that space. When I got my first crop, this is my first crop of grain, 2014 of durum, I was blown away by how much more money I can make raising both organic grain and livestock. And so when we were thinking about how do we expand the livestock, but also make it so that we don't have to rely on the livestock so much, we've started to think about it in a few different ways. Right now, we are a completely vertically integrated livestock operation. We have a cow-calf herd. We're going to be raising those calves out to 2 years old, and then we sell them as slaughter beef. That is it's a lot. You basically have 3 herds to manage. So I want to ask the group right now, who here raises livestock? Okay, and I'm just going to spin through since I think we have some time, starting with the Wep Kings and then moving on over. Could you describe what you raise?
35 breeding cows in a bowl, which is asking a lot. So we don't have the best settling rates, which is fine because again, it's not our primary source. We're grain farmers primarily. But we raise them until they're 18 months old and then they actually go to the liver. We go to direct market, grass-fed, feed them through the something like our finish them on grass next year and sell all the market.
I love that. And that's something I hope we can get inspired from this talk, is this sort of communal services ecosystem where we can be thinking about, if we're not interested in being beef meat sellers, how can we fit and be useful to someone else? Who is the next one back here? Yeah.
We raise goats.
Okay.
Contract raiser, more in agroforestry-based systems. So move them around and do the brush management type stuff.
Awesome. And are you slaughtering or are you sending them out? Okay, great, yeah. Who else? Beef, anyway, livestock, yeah.
Like deer calves and stuff, right?
Okay, and are you certified organic for that?
No.
Oh.
Grain transition.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
I have a grass-fed yak herd.
Nice.
Direct marketing.
All right. Brilliant. And are you just livestock or do you have an integrated system as well?
We do row crops as well.
Okay.
We do white corn and oats organically, and then our herd's not certified, but we treat it like it is.
Brilliant.
Absolutely.
When I first saw the yak that has a horse's tail, I just could not reconcile. I was thinking, Minnesota, you all got some problems. I don't know what's going on here. Did you? Yes.
Guinea fowl, duck, more kinds of duck, chicken, goat.
Brilliant. Yes. I will give away the sort of the thread here that I'm going to talk mostly about cows today. And that is for 2 reasons. One, that I have a lot of experience with cows, but 2, that they're really easy to keep in as compared to these other species. And so that's where my bias lands, just to be forthright. But I want to talk as much as you all want to talk about these other species, since I think there's a lot of questions about deriving value from a lot of species. On this side, any livestock raisers? Yes.
Turkey herd, dairy,
Awesome. All right, well, we're going to lean on you then for some of these ideas. We can stress test them right away. Anyone else on this side in the livestock business?
60 cows organic dairy.
Okay.
Still slaughter cows. Cool cows are still organic slaughter.
Awesome. All right. Well, the two dairy folks, I've got questions for you as we go throughout the day, so I'm glad you're in the room. A little bit more about the crops we raise. We raise bangin' yellow peas. We usually get 40 or 50 bushels an acre. We have a ton of residue left over, and it was also this inspiration that led us to try to figure out how can we be grazing some of that residue? How can we be not just spreading it back on the field, but digesting it a little bit with our animals? So in this field, it's about a 100-acre field. It was the first one that we originally fenced so that we could be getting into grazing it after we do our harvest. For our durum and our spring wheat, that's going to be, again, our most valuable crop, but also our most prone to weeds. And weeds is another reason, as I'll explain in a minute, that I really want to hold on to the cows on my operation. And even though I love traveling, I love getting away in the wintertime, I find cows to be too invaluable to let that part of the enterprise go as a means of weed control. We, every 5 or so years, raise lentils or garbanzo beans. It's also a very flimsy crop. It's going to have a huge susceptibility to weeds, so we're trying to figure out how do we build in that rotation that's going to fight the weeds. A little bit more on our yellow peas. In the weeds, though, we have basically one giant hammer. We have a lot of little hammers. You can do some infield weeding. You can use some harrows, some blind cultivation. But we're really looking at how do we mine out that seed bank. And that's worth our alfalfa. And so we raise about half of our rotation at any one time in alfalfa. We're going to have a nurse crop that goes into alfalfa, usually spring planted. And we're looking to have both irrigated as well as dryland alfalfa. But it's going to be allowing us to both put down enough nitrogen to feed that spring wheat crop, getting enough nitrogen to produce our 14 or 15 protein wheat, while also weeding off our major weeds, which out in Montana, where I am, are bindweed and thistle, and then some of our annual weeds. We want really good ground cover with our alfalfa. And again, I don't want to lose the thread. We are going to talk about livestock. But the reason I have livestock is because I need a friend to eat this stuff. And thinking about how do we really make it so that livestock and alfalfa can be winning propositions on an operation. So we cross-plant our alfalfa. We get a really thick stand. I'm more interested in quality because most of my alfalfa that I sell goes to dairies in Iowa. Most of the alfalfa that I keep, I'll take as first cutting or the weedier stuff and put through my own cows. Oops. We put up both round bales and square bales. And when I've talked to folks in different workshops about alfalfa or about hay in general, oftentimes it's just another enterprise that folks don't want to add. It's more work. It's a completely different set of equipment. From my vantage point, we got into the hay business for about $9,000. It's about a $3,000 baler. We have a $6,000 little tractor that we're doing it. And it's something that we're doing in basically the off season for the rest of our operation. We're really busy planting. It takes half of our ground away from needing to be planted in April. And then it also, after we're done planting and we have from essentially May through July free, then we can be haying. And though I don't want to create more work, it does make it so that it's an even window. We can't really ship round bales to Iowa. You have to get special permits. It's a wide load. Logistically, it's much more expensive. So we also have our square bales put up by a custom operator. We try to balance how much square and round we put up because we want to feed the rounds. Very easy to feed on pasture, very low labor. We don't have to have a bunk, versus squares need a little bit more attention, but they're very easy to ship. We graze all of our crop residue now. We have one field that's unfenced and the rest are fenced now after a lot of years of working to get that fencing around. We'll talk a lot about fencing throughout this presentation, but I want to be able to turn that into something that's going to cycle more quickly, and I want to be able to ideally till less in the fall. We have highly erodible soils, our erosion risk primarily comes from wind as opposed to water. And so if we can try to not till and incorporate residue in the fall, we're able to get a lot more done if we're using cattle. The cattle do need to be supplemented on this sort of feed. This isn't good enough feed to really keep them thrifty and gaining, and so we will have some supplementation while they're on stubble or grazing residue. Typically that'll be an alfalfa pellet. When we got into hay in Montana is very different than the way you all do hay out here. We put it up, we can store it outside without covering it. It's gonna be something that needs very little attention, but mostly because we're not having a very premium market for it. We're going to primarily be sending it into our beef herds. Those beef herds just aren't worth as much as your dairy cows. And so I had to learn quickly, how am I going to build a system that's actually making a product that I can sell, that I'm not just sitting on? And so we got better varieties. We really looked at our timing for cutting and tried to get superior to premium quality dairy hay that we're going to be putting up as our second and third cutting in our square bales. Didn't realize that was a video. Okay, the other thing that I'm hunting for with the cattle is manure. For my own cattle, I'm going to have a bedded pack, and we're going to be utilizing that manure to feed again onto our spring wheat to make sure that nitrogen is there so that we're able to realize those premium qualities that pretty much justifies the rest of the rotation. We don't have a spreader, so we have that custom spread. And so when we're thinking about the logistics of bringing on a beef enterprise or any sort of livestock enterprise, thinking about these extra pieces of equipment that you might only use once a year and if they're around. As we look to the manure, it gives us quite a few options, especially if we have it on our farm, to not import quite so much weed seed. We're always worried about bringing on more weeds than we already have, and so we're going to be looking at how to feed our own hay, our own forages off of our farm, which is representative of the weeds that are already there. We're not importing anything new or exotic. We do use a little bit of bedded pack as well as pen pack. The reason that spreading manure, I find it to just be a not as good as grazing option, is because a ton of the nitrogen from animals is actually from the urine. And so you don't want to be losing that, having that slough off, having that evaporate, if you can help it. So the more grazing, the more direct application we can get with our herds, the better our nitrogen value is. I'm really sensitive to my landlords. I'm only on rented land. I'm really sensitive to my landlord's aesthetic opinion of my fields. And so when it gets weedy, and I heard people just like pictures of dogs, so she is really irrelevant to the slide. But when it gets weedy, say in my annual crop that I just have a flush in 2022, we had sort of historic flooding. We had a ton of rain. And so when we were figuring out how to put our crops in there, we were late, and then there was a ton more water that flushed all of the weeds that we had over the last 10 years. So I had a lot of fields that my landlords were concerned about. I farm in a peri-urban environment, so I have 50 to 100 acre fields, but they're very close to town. And so I wanted an option to be able to swath these down if they get too far ahead, so I'm not building out a weed seed bank that's going to haunt me for years to come. And so we'll either swath down a grain or an annual crop that's gotten too weedy, gotten too far away from us, and graze it, or if we hit it at the right point, we'll put it into bales. Our early harvested cereals are going to usually make still fairly good quality feed. We lack a good energy source in the grass-fed market, and so if we get it before it's gone to head, we can usually sell those to grass dairy farmers. And generally, it just makes it so that we have options. We don't just have to stare at a field that's going to be constantly ripening weeds and then putting out seed. All right, now I think of the great herd transformation, the great migration that we're all hoping happens in the Midwest or in the West, as a less agronomic question than an infrastructure question. I was speaking at the Northern Plains Sustainable Ag Conference in Aberdeen, South Dakota, landed in Fargo, drove to Aberdeen, and on the way I just had one observation, and that was I saw no fences anywhere. I didn't see a fence on the side of the road. I didn't see a fence 2 miles in. There were just no fences. So as we think about adding livestock as an enterprise to our own operation, fencing is likely going to be something we have to think about quite a bit, because as crop farmers, oftentimes there's not a lot of fencing to build off of. It's going to be fairly new build. Who here farms next to roads or has busy roads? I see enough hands that this merits a little discussion. I'm not going to talk about no fence or these technologies that are very exciting but sort of nascent, because legally I have to have very strict fence requirements when I farm along roads to make sure that cows aren't getting out and getting hit. And so I've been having to have a lot of very both nuanced but also longer term visioning discussions with my landlords about how we can cost share putting fence up, how it's going to be a benefit to the cropping system, how it's going to be allowing me to have some options when I'm farming their land, when I'm figuring out how to make sure we still drive revenue even if we have some crop failures. And so I would say that two pictures here represent kind of the extremes: a single strand of polywire versus woven permanent fence. Woven permanent fence being probably the most expensive that I could put up, and the temporary polywire being the cheapest. The woven permanent fence would be representative of something that I'm going to have on the along roads and against finicky neighbors who don't like cows getting out. But on the whole, we can get a lot done with not a ton of infrastructure when it comes to fencing. So the questions I always ask myself when I'm looking at a field is, what are you trying to fence in? If it's cows, if it's goats, if it's yaks, if it's chickens, and what is the risk if that animal gets out? If my cows get out on certain fields, I'm going to have a call from the neighbor, and it might cost a little bit of feed. If my cow gets out onto a road, I might lose my farm. So I want to be weighing those things when I'm thinking about where am I going to put my resources, and if I'm first going to get into livestock, where's maybe an easier field to fence? Trying to pick those further out, less near the action of the road. This is what most of my fences look like, though. I'm going to have single strands of polywire on both field edges, as long as they're not near roads, or I'm not worried about animals traveling to roads, but also because if I don't like how this fence is serving me, I can get rid of it, bring it up, pull those stakes, and move on. But a lot of these fences have been up for years. They're very useful. They're a good way to demarcate where I'm going to be functionally managing the fields. If you're a little bit more off the beaten path, you can do perimeter fences. I would recommend 2 strands of high tensile wire versus the poly wire. And that's mostly because when an animal hits a high tensile wire, it's going to think for a second and possibly turn around. If an animal's running and it hits a poly wire, it's going to go right through it, and it's not going to even think about it. And so then you have the animals running after it if you have a herd scenario. So I recommend the 2 because it gives you as well options on what kinds of animals you're going to have on your property. There's 3 classes we're going to talk about: sort of older heifers, cow-calf pairs, and then calves. When we think about calves, we're thinking about the least trained animal in the herd and the most likely to slip under a fence or test fences. So I want that electric wire at a visual height that's going to mean something to a shorter animal. I also want to make sure that it's hot enough that anything that gets tired or bored or starts to push on fences is going to get a stronger zap than, say, with the poly wire. A little bit more about our operation. So we're first generation. We started growing cows in 2004 and then grain in 2014. And so I have no land in Montana that I own. I am going to be spread out about 30 miles from north to south. I'm going to be tractoring a lot of animals all over the place, and you can kind of see a spread of my fields. I have one seed growing field all the way down in northern Wyoming that I haul that little combine down to. The reason I'm talking about being spread out and having a lot of leased land is it's going to require a lot of conversations with landlords and some strategy about whether or not certain fields are even good logistically to have livestock on. This was the first piece of infrastructure investment that I made before I could drive when I was 12. So my dad had to drive this, but I did own it. And I got it for $500 from an estate sale. And I still have it to the day. It's a great trailer. I trailer all of my animals though between these pastures. And so I don't have any sort of cattle drive that I'm able to engage in. Everything's going to get loaded up and moved. With leased land, there's usually not very much infrastructure. And so you're not going to see a lot of corrals. You're not going to see, where I am, all of that's been removed. And so if we're looking at how are we going to manage, what is the minimum viable product that we can get on a piece of ground to make it grazable? So we're going to have a trailer as our foundation, and then we need to figure out water. This is probably a bigger problem where I am than where you all are, but surface water and surface water in the right place is something that I am challenged by all the time. We have a few options. We can have wells. We can have piped over municipal water, depending on your location. We can have live surface water like streams or ponds, or we can truck in water, which is my very least favorite thing to do that we have to do during droughts. We moved about 700,000 gallons of water a couple summers ago when lots of our streams dried up. So thinking about if you've got a piece of ground, you're kind of entertaining grazing it, what is that water source and is it going to be reliable? And if you don't have it there, I'm going to have two programs for you with NRCS that are dying to be deployed, no matter what state you're in, and it's for water and fencing improvement. Who here has gotten any NRCS funding for fencing? And did you get, what kind of fencing did you get? Cross fencing? Perimeter. All right. So this is something that I feel is maybe more exciting than not, is nationally now, every state, there's a new $1.10 per linear foot program to pay for perimeter fencing. And that's somewhat novel. It's only a few years old, and used to be that you could only do cross fencing. So you had to pay for the perimeter, the most important fence yourself. Now that can be cost shared. So as you're thinking about also what fields, you found your field, it's got good growing biomass on it, you're gonna have some water on it, you're getting ready to perimeter fence it. As you talk to your landlord, as you do the cost analysis as to whether or not it's a good idea, talk to your NRCS agent as well about what programs you might be able to enroll in to get some perimeter fencing.
You know the program number on that?
I will get it to you. I think I have it in the slide deck, but if not, I'm going to make sure you have it before we leave. Thank you. 328. If you're in Dane County, it's 413. This is the stuff, folks. Anyone, any other places? One other thing that I failed to mention at the beginning was I'm a huge fan of questions as we go. I hate waiting till the end because I always forget my questions. So if anyone has any questions, please just shout it out. Like I said, I have almost no built-in infrastructure in any of the fields that I farm, so I'm going to have everything be mobile. Another thing, along with the trailer that I bought when I was 12, was a full set of corral panels that came off this estate sale. And it's served me completely through this day that I'm able to set it up, take it down, move it around. I usually have, in say a 100-acre field, a maximum of about 25 animals that I'm moving, so that's about 2+ trailer loads. I can usually get away with just one of these pens and chasing them along a fence to capture them. But generally, if I'm going to have, maybe 80 mother cows, I want to be able to sort them, work them, and so I'm going to do the whole setup. I like this because I get to own it forever. When it comes time to lose a lease, when it comes time to move on, this is coming with me, rather than having to risk investing in pretty serious infrastructure on land you don't own. So our pieces here, we're going to have fencing, we're going to have water, and we're going to have some sort of corrals that complement the existing trailer that we're going to be moving animals around in. Now we grow quite a bit of cover crops, mostly for nitrogen, but I've started to grow them almost more so for feed. So that I'm going to have an annual that I can try out a lot of different things, and I'm going to be able to maximize both soil health but also revenue from that cover crop that otherwise might get dissed in. Now I have way too many acres of cover crop to be eaten by just my cows. And so I have been looking at how do I be useful to my neighbors when they have maybe drying out rangeland, they have rangeland that they haven't been able to get to yet because it's too early in the season. That's where I find my cover crops to be most in demand. So thinking about when we have cover crops and say we have fencing now, how would we reach out to our neighbors? The great thing about organic is that those cows do not need to be organic to graze on organic land. And so if you're thinking about dabbling in cows, dabbling in livestock, being useful to any of your neighbors, conventional or organic, you're going to get a fairly similar price on the whole for that rent. The thing you're going to want to consider, though, is labor, and we'll talk about that more in just a bit. We raise a few sheep, depending on the time of year. We're going to be using those for more of our close cover. We want to be able to graze something down to the absolute nubbins. Sheep have teeth in the front of their mouth versus cows only having it in the back, so sheep can really get down to almost moonscape. So if I want to remove everything off a field, if I want to make sure they eat all of the weeds down, then I oftentimes deploy sheep after my cows. As you can see, sheep are going to require some different fencing considerations. We're going to need to have woven wire. Usually, I feel like there are folks who do either barbed wire or single strands of electric, but the second you have a real wool coat on that animal, they're going to be able to be insulated and move right through it. So sheep are something that I find to be a lot less labor intensive. They're a lot safer. You're not dealing with a 2,000-pound animal, but you're going to have to contend with that woven wire question. My favorite class to graze and to have come on my operation as a custom class are dry cows, mostly because they are already trained to fences. And so I want to have something that is not going to push it, not going to be very excitable, and also doesn't need very good feed. They're sort of at a midpoint in their gestation. They're going to be able to find good nutrition kind of throughout the field, as opposed to fresh lactating cows or not. If I'm looking at my dairy neighbors, this is a group of dairy heifers that we bring on, they're going to usually have a little, they don't need as much help with their dry cows. It's usually more heifers that we're going to be dealing with. Thinking about how do we keep those heifers in is going to be a primary consideration, but I often love heifers because they can get a lot of them. With grazing, I find that it's hard to terminate the fields as fast as I want to without the numbers. My own cows aren't enough to terminate, say, my annual crops or my cover crops, so I want to get a big group of heifers together and be able to just take it on. Usually I'm going to put heifers of this age between, say, 6 months and a year into something with a little bit more solid fencing. I'm going to have either barbed wire or I'm going to be having several strands of hot wire. My least favorite class is cow-calf pairs. So I have my cow-calf pairs who are wonderfully trained and are usually pretty well behaved, but calves just don't know what they, unless they're coming from an electric fence or coming from a dairy, they're just not going to know what they're looking at. And so I always put cow-calf pairs as far from the road as I possibly can, and with really good fencing around them so that I'm not running into problems. Now, the labor component of this is mostly making sure that those cows aren't getting out. Hopefully you're not hauling water to them. If you are, you have my sympathy. But if you aren't hauling water, it's going to be, are we able to keep those cows in? And usually that's through monitoring an electric fence. So I, for a lot of years, would twice, 3 times a day be running out to different electric fences, just testing it by hand. There are now better monitoring systems that will send you a text when it falls below a certain voltage. This is a great job for anyone who has a 14-year-old who has just gotten a driver's license and wants to be driving small amounts around the county, being able to check this fence. This is really important because if you have maybe an hour where that fence is off, if you, say, have cow-calf pairs, there's going to be animals rubbing on it. They're constantly testing these boundaries, especially young animals. And so we want to make sure that we have a system in place to know how are all of our fences doing at all times. With custom grazing, I'm usually charging between $1.50 and $1.75 per animal per day. Depending on the class of animal, depending on the needs of the producer, depending on how close they are, that number can vary. But I think about the amount of money that I'm putting into fencing, and I think about usually that I'm planting some sort of seed. And so I'm offering fairly good feed. good feed at the right time of year is really hard to come by, especially on pasture. And so when we think about the cost of raising, say, a dairy heifer, you're usually looking at an animal that has to stay fairly close to an operation, but producers would love to get rid of and send them out because they don't need to be near a milking parlor. And you dairy folks, jump in here if you want to add anything to this. But in thinking about custom raising heifers or having the opportunity to realize more benefit from the pasture for the milking cows rather than the young stock, becoming well-versed and getting a good reputation as a heifer grazer can be an awesome opportunity, but even more an awesome opportunity for the folks who are sending you animals. When looking at the potential for grazing, I usually try to take animals for at least a month because I don't want to have to waste a bunch of my resources moving those animals, taking a lot of trailer time. And I've had it happen before where it's dried out a lot faster than I thought it was going to, and I have to move animals more quickly. And that is just a huge logistical nightmare because it's usually right during harvest of my grain. So I'm trying to be in a combine, not in a trailer. In looking at the how you find customers or how you get folks who want to graze, there is the Grazers Exchange in various regions. I find, though, that literally reaching out to any neighbor that you see having cows, I've never met a cattle person who doesn't need some extra pasture at some point. And especially if your pasture is certified organic, you're going to be able to have a pretty solid market right away. That being said, if you want to be getting into the organic business, then we'll talk about that a little bit more. So custom feeding, I think of this as a different activity than grazing. If I'm going to actually have my folks out there spreading bales, feeding animals during the wintertime, doing wintertime care and maintenance, usually I'm between $2 and $2.75 a day. Typically, I love this system because I'm going to just stack the hay from that field right in the field, and I'm going to be able to then feed it on that field, keeping that nutrient cycle closed. My best fields come from the fields that I'm able to, my best crops come from the fields that I'm able to custom feed over the winter and return all that nutrition. But that requires wintertime water, which a lot of systems are not set up to do. That also requires someone who's actually going to be out there feeding and caring for them. So you need to make sure that it's worth it to you. I usually do winter feeding for a small group, maybe 50 animals, custom, and then I have the rest of mine at home. Paying for fence, I think of in two buckets. We've talked about NRCS and being able to pull in equip money to do perimeter and cross fencing, but being able to make the case for how much extra you're going to be able to drive in revenue and having that conversation with your landlords or as a business proposition for yourselves is something that I do on every single field, so I know if I get the chance to grow or graze in this field, this is what it would take to be able to make that investment. Typically, we're building fence between $4 and $5 a linear foot. And so that's kind of a bare maintenance fence. That's not woven wire. Woven wire is going to be quite a bit more expensive, but it's usually a labor question. High tensile electric fence is going to be fairly easy to set up. It's going to be pounded posts. It's going to be able to be run off a four-wheeler. So it's really just your labor or that custom operator's labor, depending on the availability in your area. Who here, again, a show of hands of who sells any organic beef? Okay. This is very normal. Organic beef is one of those oddly nascent markets, partly because the industry got really well acquainted with cull cows. And so if you're in the dairy space, you're going to be selling your animals after their useful life as milkers into the ground beef. And that's kind of the organic beef that we have, Costco bricks. The more premium organic beef is usually going to be coastal markets. And so all of our beef goes down into Colorado and then up into Northern California to be sold through Whole Foods. That's a unique supply chain. It's not a carbon-friendly supply chain, so I'm constantly looking for how do we get markets closer to home. The reason I ask about is there a lot of organic folks selling beef is just because I see the greatest opportunity being a custom grazer for either conventional operations or for dairies, so that you don't have to necessarily invest all the way into an enterprise and add yet more marketing onto yourself, but you can still realize the agronomic benefits and the revenue from custom operators. A little bit about cattle markets, if anyone's interested. We usually sell our animals for about $3 to $4 on the rail, so usually about 650-pound carcasses. And typically we're selling them live, so we're selling them by the semi-load. We don't typically deal direct to consumer. I got my start dealing direct to consumer, and it can be a great business if you have the bandwidth or someone who's interested in doing it. I really like hearing John's example of getting married up with a finisher marketer, because right now in organics, there's not a lot of specialization. You're going to have, like me, doing the entire process from cow-calf all the way through finisher. And we don't have someone that I can then sell calves to, or that I could take on as a finisher operation. So the more folks we have getting in, dabbling in beef, I think that's going to be where we realize a growing opportunity in the market. A few folks who buy organic beef, buy calves, buy finished animals, open range beef out in Nebraska. They're a big beef buyer. It's a small premium on conventional, but it's a very consistent premium. Sunfed Ranch buys long yearlings, and so if you're getting into the beef business and you want to be able to take your animals, say, over the winter after you've calved and have a market, still a live animal market, those are going to be taken out west, and they're also in basically across Whole Foods. And one example of a growing market is B-Bar Ranch. They're out in Montana, and they're buying certified organic calves, and they're actually having a little bit of trouble sourcing enough of them. And so if you're, again, thinking about wanting to have some ownership rather than just custom grazing, there's a growing number of operations who do that. We've only talked about beef in this conversation, really, and so I wanted to touch real quick on poultry as well. When I was, again, looking around at what is the barrier to young folks in my area or folks getting into farming, it's a lot easier, as it was for me, to start with livestock. You don't need as much land. You need a lot less equipment. I was able to just start with a trailer and some panels. But being able to have a consistent source of organic feed is kind of that bottleneck. And so when I was looking at how much I was giving away in the dockage of my grains, when I clean my own grains, when I have split grains, when I have grain that just don't make the cut. I've, a lot of years, had too much rain, which gives me too many bushels of wheat at too low of a protein. And so that grain is not for my premium markets. That grain is going to end up going as an energy source into my feed mill. When thinking about what other avenues we have for our grains, I think of livestock integration as just an opportunity to add value to any crop or any pasture that we're going to be otherwise trying to feed the soil with. And so with that, I would take any questions you all might have or any ideas. I think this is a group that can be a great resource to each other as well. All right, thank you. Matt Fitzgerald.
Nick, can you talk about like the human labor component, like how many people would take on your operation, or you think about animal units?
Absolutely, yes. So the thing I hate about cows is that one person can take care of one cow, or they can take care of probably 200. And so I am desperately underemploying someone if I'm only having them take care of like 50, because you can take care of so many more. So I think of like between 1 and 200 as a single person's job with a lot of time built in, that you're able to have 2 key activities, which is checking fence, checking water, and then just counting animals, making sure they're around. Generally, though, that's kind of bookending a day job. And so when I'm out and about, I'm usually like 7 in the morning or 4 in the afternoon, looking at these different groups, being able to identify if I have any problems. I try to marry that if I'm going to be doing other field activity, other work around that area. So I can do a lot of it myself, but I always have one person hired to be helping me with the animals as well during the grazing season. Yeah.
I have a couple questions. One, you talked about spreading manure for spring wheat. A photo of it, and I'm just curious your timing with that. And do you no-till the So just curious to hear some of the challenges of that, and what percentage of your operation is in cover crops versus grain crops?
I did not, no. So I'll try to answer your questions in order. So for spreading manure, I'm usually going on before it's warm enough to plant. So we try to wait until 45 degrees to plant our spring wheat. And so as soon as the snow is off, say in late February, early March, then we'll have spreading in March. We want to make sure that the ground is pretty dry. That's not our problem in Montana. It is a dry place. So the nutrient runoff problems are much more minimal than, say, in the Midwest. We're usually going to have some light tillage after that. I have a Mandeco storm disc that I'm going to run over everything, just disturbing about the top 1 or 2 inches, just to get an even, homogeneous zone. I then have a Great Plains no-till drill that I'm going to take and plant the spring wheat with. I do that Great Plains no-till on all of my crops, just because I want to be able to have the chunkiest soil possible with the least risk of erosion. And so I'm going to be able to go through everything. I've gone on several of my fields, I've gone about 3 years without any tillage because of that Great Plains drill. And so I'll be able to go my spring wheat, then my yellow peas, and then my flax back into alfalfa. And that's a growing weed pressure throughout that entire time. So it's how much can you stomach. But usually if I'm able to have cattle be a part of that, I notice just a greatly reduced weed pressure in any field that works in. Could you remind me the other question?
Oh yeah, what percentage of your farm is in grain crops versus cover crops or grains?
Yeah, so it depends on the crop I'm going into, but I'd say probably about 25% at any one time. I don't do full season cover crops. I'll terminate them and then plant into them, mostly because we do have enough moisture. We have about half of our acres are irrigated. So we're able to play with that timing a little bit as well, where we're able to grow up a cover crop in the fall and terminate it after we've taken off, say, wheat in August. We'll have August to November to grow a crop and then graze it down. Or we'll do something, a winter planted crop that we would terminate fairly early, depending on if we're doing flax, which can be planted a little bit later, or buckwheat, depending on the year. As far as distance, I think the biggest thing is feeling like you have a fairly good confidence that the fence is working, that those animals are not going to be escaping. I also would say that I have to be within a 10-minute drive, or have someone within a 10-minute drive of any animal. As I was getting started, I want to say as like a 19, 20-year-old, I had a lot of animals getting out all the time. Very nice neighbors who would just be saying, hey, could you come get them back in? But at that time, I was about an hour drive from that field. And so I'd be just spending too much time driving back and forth. So those animals came home, that field stopped being a pasture until I could fence it to where it's an extraordinary event if they get out.
What's your calving season, and do you calve on pasture, or do you calve in lots during calving?
I calve them on pasture. I haven't pulled a calf since 2007, so I'm obsessed with low birth weight bulls. But usually I'm calving in May. And so I'm going to be calving kind of in that peak cover crop period, or if I'm on a grass alfalfa mix that we're able to grow. One thing I didn't talk about is that I also grow quite a bit of sainfoin as part of my mix, and that's a legume. I think it's fairly unique to the West. Beautiful purple flower, but it is a non-bloating legume. So they're able to graze it, get maximum protein without having the risk of bloat. Most of my cows, I'm fairly comfortable having a good amount of alfalfa in the mix without bloat, but I'm always conscious of it, and that's something we're always checking for as well. Do we have any problems with that? So typically April to May, late April, early May for calving. Yeah.
Just a remark, I was at the Livestock conference 2 days ago, and someone mentioned that for the heifers, you said that if they're treaty, you have them stay inside. Someone mentioned that they put an adult to the heifers, and that calms them down, and the adults can release the heifers.
Love that idea. Yes. I should do that myself. And I usually don't, because I don't mix classes. So I don't want any animal that's not part of that herd, or rather mixed herds. I want that to be separate.
What was the comment?
Yeah, sorry and apologies for not repeating these. So he was saying that with tricky heifers who have a tendency to get out, putting a more mellow adult in the group who understands the fencing system better can be a way to anchor them. Yeah.
curious, I think you mentioned you sell some of your grass hay to dairy farm in Iowa. It's just an interesting market. It seems like a lot of road miles to transfer it, and I'm surprised it's not a closer source. Can you kind of talk about that market a little bit?
Definitely. I think hay in America flows towards droughts. And so in southern Iowa, it seems like we're always having some sort of drought or some sort of inopportune conditions down into Missouri. And so that's usually supplementing their otherwise fairly robust forage production. Western hay is a little unique compared to Midwest hay because we are so dry that we can cure it in the field. We can produce dry hay really easy, and we can get really high protein. And so oftentimes, folks will be dedicating their acres to haylage or silage, which is going to be the bulk of the nutrients, but they just want that really concentrated protein to help produce the milk. And so that ours will be more a supplement rather than something they would buy for their whole herd. Yeah, in the back. Between 22 and 24%. Yeah, so we're like, in our premium, we're 24% shooting for that. Our first cutting, we're scaring up 18%, and then usually 4 percentage points up each time.
What plant species are your pastures made up of for your calving?
Yeah, so that's going to be all native range. So we're going to have like blue grama, we're going to have yarrow, we're going to have other bunch grasses. There's going to be some clovers that have been broadcast in there, but mostly it's going to be crested wheat and other introduced intermediate wheat grasses.
You're not, once you get them established, you're not reseeding them anymore.
Not on those ones, and those ones will be typically the pretty non-tillable sides of the fields. We have a lot of topography. It didn't really come out here, but we farm on a lot of slopes, and so most of the sharper sides of those slopes will remain in perennial range and not be tilled. And so we'll sort of just create corridors that we have different classes out of easy, well-protected areas that are going to be fairly dry all the time. Mud and calving is the two things I always want to keep far apart. And I put up a lot of straw. I do bed even on pasture, a lot of it. But with perennial pastures that are going to have really deep roots and be able to drain really well, that's what my goal is, to have them on. Yeah.
Is the fence tester that came to your cell phone, is that a subscription, or how much does that cost us?
I think it's $400 for the monitor, and it's like maybe $60 a year subscription.
So that's good to know. One thing I did a workaround, like the farmer version of that, where I took a fence tester and then just hooked it up to the fence and then used a remote camera.
Love that. Yes.
Like, Instagram with a remote camera.
That is so great. Yes, I'm all about that.
And then secondly, I was hoping I could get the number of your financial advisor that you had when you were 11.
She's a great lady, that mom of mine. Yes, sir.
This is a little far afield. I'm going to ask more of your NLP experience policy question. I think I always feel a lot of people here that feel that the main bottleneck, it feels like, is this chicken leg problem with the lack of organic processes and slaughter facilities. Most of our peers are doing grass-fed cattle in the area and direct marketing. They are organic farmers, but they don't bother with the certification because there might be one or two in southern Wisconsin that do it, but they're all booked up like too far. And what level is that, like the top-down sort of penalty policy level, are to kind of work at that bottleneck?
I would say that has been a focus of much broader USDA than just NOP, kind of in the COVID beginning rush of money that's been going in the form of grants to agriculture. Poultry and red meat slaughter plants were billions and billions set up. Two things to possibly answer your question. One, it is the easiest certification to get a slaughter plant certified organic. It's literally just their sanitizers, and that's all they change. And a lot of them already have cleaning protocols that are compliant, and then making them comfortable tracking animals in and out. So I hope that we're able to identify a slaughterhouse near us and send them my way, and I will do that consultation for free to get them certified. It's very easy. We can lock them up. But that greater question of of processing capacity in general, USDA especially, that we can then cross state lines with the meat, has not been solved. I think it's, when I look at the, I think 10 plus billion that have been sent to it, I see us having a sort of a continual problem where the location of all players are incorrect. And so we'll have cow-calf producers not next to folks who are going to be feeding, and then we have feeding not close to the slaughter, and we have slaughter not close to the people. So figuring out a really good logistics analysis of where should those best be placed. What small slaughterhouses are thriving, and not just because they're charging exorbitant fees to farmers. I feel like that's a different way to make money, but actually having a solid business where you can have a commercially viable meat product for that farmer, and no one is taking too much out of the system to make it happen. We have, I think, 6 certified organic slaughterhouses in Montana, and it's mostly just because we've had organic ranchers continually be those good customers who have driven them. And we have like small population centers that are okay consumers of organic that have helped carry that on. As we look to the future, I think figuring out first, how do we identify those thriving plants, and then figure out how we get more people to set up feeding and growing facilities closer to them. I think then you can grow the calves anywhere, even up to yearlings. It's just really that finishing period that we need to spend some resources looking at. So a very incomplete question, unfortunately, but a lot of money being spent to figure it out.
This is another policy comment.
Yeah.
More of a local policy. Some of you may have heard of Sarah Boyd, who does a lot of advocacy through Wisconsin Farmers Union. She was just talking to me the other week that they're trying to push through the Wisconsin state legislature some policy incentive for our dairy state, or conventional dairy, any dairy, to incentivize them to raise heifers and potentially dry cows, and definitely heifers on pasture. So, as Nate said, it doesn't have to be organic cows. So we do have an opportunity, and it sounds like it might be more building relationships, but obviously fencing and water is a huge issue, but potentially bringing in some of those conventional animals. So just on the lookout if you're in Wisconsin, if that's something that would interest you to try to push forward some of that legislation or incentive for getting more animals out on pasture and building those relationships.
That's a great shout out. I would say that $1.50 a day, $1.75 a day that we're charging for custom grazing is still markedly less, if you're actually doing the numbers honestly, than feeding an animal on an operation. And so we have an opportunity to save cattle owner money, as well as make some money ourselves as crop growers. Yeah, Mike.
Correct me if I'm wrong, in the state of Montana, don't they have a portable slaughter co-op that's going on by Gaber somewhere that they can mobile go on-site and butcher?
They do. And the analogy I've heard is that, why do you see so many trailers and trailer parks never move? Because it sucks to move a house. And that is what they've experienced with that the benefits realized of going out to field, having folks who are used to both being good tradesmen at the slaughter and able to move, was just so inefficient that they're only doing it for bison now. So that slaughter unit is actually parked inside a building, and they're just doing it right there in one location now. And I think I've heard that. I don't know if you guys have heard of, trying to think of Sarah, not Flack. I'll think of the name, but talking about this very concept of smaller brick and mortar being kind of the most efficient, most ideal scenario, rather than this mobile unit. The mobile unit, I think, was $400,000, so it wasn't a very cheap thing either. And they've realized a lot of potential just figuring out how do we get a 10 head a week slaughter plant going, kill floor, even if the fabrication is done elsewhere and shipped off site. I'm going to go back and then Matt. Awesome. Yeah.
Some of them, they ship to Colorado, have them raised there, and then ship them all the way back to Europe.
And I'm just like, that's a business. That's a business to get into. That's a business to be able to say, I'm going to save you a 3,000-mile round trip. Yeah. Matt.
Nate, can you talk about your feed business a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So we started off, it was really 2020, and looking at shipping, and Mike has been helping us with this project, but shipping clean grain to customers. And so when we got a grain cleaner, we realized that we just had a decent amount of chaff. We have some years where we have like really bad weeds, say like pigweed, that's just producing a ton of material, but still has a feed proposition. And so we've been taking cleanings, and we've been taking non-food grade grains, like if we've had an inopportune rain on our yellow peas that caused them to shrivel, or we had some really low falling numbers in our wheat, and just putting that into bins and coming up with formulations that are primarily cereal grains, so barley or wheat, mixed with yellow peas. And then we have a nutritionist help us out with the amino acid content to make sure we're getting a balanced diet. And then we'll just sort of spot buy these other crops that whoever has run into an issue with a crop that they really wanted to grow agronomically but had no market for, we can usually take that. So I'm thinking of like millet being just an incredible crop for feed, very hard crop to sell for food in today's market, but it was one of the only crops that really grow in kind of the southern high plains, so that Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado corner. So we'll be buying quite a bit of that up. We are, for no in particular reason, we don't have corn or soy growing near us, so it's by default sort of a corn, soy-free ration. And we're usually able to do a really good layer ration. We're a little bit more iffy on, say, a chick starter, that we mostly focus on mature animal rations, just because we're not using soy, which is usually the source of that really punchy protein. Yeah, so we have a hammer mill, and then we have a mixer, and then we're usually having about 4 bins for different ingredients that we're running at any one time. The hammer mill is going to then feed into a conveyance system that's going to mix, and then we're going to pelletize it. So because we're using a bunch of irregular ingredients, we don't want sorting from the animals, and so this last year we've invested in a pelleting line for the feed as our first goal, but then we've actually started to pelletize alfalfa as well. Our goal is to be able to ship alfalfa via rail to the Midwest, which would save about 75% of the cost, rather than on trucks in bales. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you.
And again, this conference is really, it is what it is because of you all and your participation and the great questions in the session and sharing information. And I'm just so grateful to be here with you all and be able to work with you all as a role at the university, and just looking forward to continued work together the next few years. So hopefully I see some of you in the room next door, but safe travels back home. Thank you.